There are legends that sound too wild to be true, stories that walk the thin line between man and myth. And among all the tales born from the Wild West, one name stands above them all: liver-eating Johnston. He was said to be a man of impossible strength, a hunter of men, and a survivor of the harshest land on earth. They say he fought entire tribes alone, vanishing into the mountains like a ghost. Some whispered he was part beast, part man, a creature shaped by revenge. But behind the stories, behind the blood and fire, there was a real man, a man named Johnston, and his life was a storm that began in silence. He was born around 1824, somewhere in Little York, New Jersey, though some say it could have been Pennsylvania. No one knows for sure, because in those days, records were thin and memories shorter. What we do know is that he grew up restless, the kind of boy who stared at the horizon and dreamed of what lay beyond. Life in the East was crowded, noisy, and full of rules. But John was not a man who could live by anyone's rules. He wanted space. He wanted danger. He wanted freedom, the kind that only existed where the maps ended. In his early years, he became a sailor. He worked the decks of ships, hauling ropes and chasing storms. The sea taught him strength, silence, and patience, three things that would one day keep him alive in the wilderness. But after years of sailing, something in him grew tired. The ocean was wide, but not wild enough. So one day he walked off a ship and headed west. He had no plan, no map, and no fear, only the fire inside him. The 1840s were the days of mountain men, men who disappeared into the Rocky Mountains, trapping beavers, hunting bears, and trading furs with native tribes. It was a hard life, cold, lonely, dangerous, but for John, it was heaven. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands like iron. Other trappers said he could swing an axe all day and still drink them under the table at night. He had no interest in cities or comfort. He slept under the stars, hunted his own food, and trusted no one but his rifle and his knife. The mountains were cruel teachers, but they made him unbreakable. In time, John found more than survival. He found love. While trading near what is now Montana, he met a woman from the Flathead, Salish tribe. Her name was never written down, but her memory lived forever in his heart. They married in a simple tribal ceremony and built a small cabin in the valley. For the first time in his life, John had something more than the wilderness. He had a home. He hunted during the day, and she kept the fire warm at night. They spoke little, but they understood everything. The silence between them was peace. The wind, the snow, the endless sky, all of it felt smaller when she was near. For a short while, Johnston was happy. And that was something the West rarely allowed any man to be. But peace never lasts long on the frontier. One winter, while John was away hunting, a small group of Crow warriors came through the valley. No one knows exactly why. Maybe for food, maybe revenge, maybe nothing at all. What is certain is that when John came back, his cabin was burned to the ground, and his wife was gone. He stood among the ashes, his hands black with soot, his eyes empty. The snow fell quietly around him. There were no tears, no words, only the quiet promise of vengeance. From that moment, the man called Johnston died. And the Crow killer was born. They say he went to war. Not against one man, not against one village, but against an entire nation. The Crow people became his sworn enemies. He tracked them through forests, across rivers, through snowstorms. He fought them hand to hand, blade to blade, and here is where the legend begins. It was said that after each kill, he would cut out his enemy's liver and eat it raw, not from hunger, but as a mark of vengeance. The Crow believed the liver was the seat of courage. To eat it was to take your enemy's strength. Did he truly do it? No one can say. Some believe it was just a tale, a rumor that grew with every campfire story. But others swear they saw it with their own eyes. Either way, the name stuck. Liver-eating Johnston, a name that froze blood faster than a mountain wind. Years later, storytellers would twist the facts, add their own colors. Books, songs, and movies would turn him into Jeremiah Johnston, the lone hero of the mountains. But the truth was not about glory. It was about grief. John didn't seek fame. He sought peace, the kind that only comes when you've buried every ghost that haunts you. And so, for years, he vanished into the wild. A man shaped by revenge, a legend born of pain. This was the beginning of the legend of liver-eating Johnston. Before the world called him a killer, before the legends and the liver-eating, John Johnston was just a man searching for a life worth living. The story of the Crow Killer didn't begin with revenge. It began with survival, raw, brutal, and lonely survival in a world that cared for no one. Narrator. The year was around 1846. The West was wild, untouched, untamed, and full of danger. The Rocky Mountains rose like jagged teeth, covered in snow and mystery. Men who entered them either came out legends or never came out at all. John Johnston was one of those men. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. He was just strong, stronger than most, and hungry for freedom. The kind of freedom that made a man fight bears, eat roots, and sleep under the stars. They say when he left the East, he changed his name from Garrison to Johnston. No one knows why. Maybe to leave his old life behind. Maybe to become someone new, someone the mountains could respect. Narrator. Life in the Rockies was no game. The cold cut through skin like knives. The silence was so deep it could drive a man mad. And yet for John, it was the only place that made sense. He learned to move with the land, to read the snow, to find food where others saw nothing but ice. He could track a deer across frozen rock or smell danger in the air before it came. Every day was a fight to stay alive. But with each sunrise, he became tougher, sharper. More like the wilderness itself. The mountain men of that era were a breed apart. Names like Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, and Jedediah Smith filled the frontier with tales of courage and madness. They weren't just explorers. They were outlaws, warriors, survivors. John Johnston learned from them. He traded furs, hunted grizzlies, and fought raiders when he had to. He lived by the law of the wilderness, kill or be killed. To the tribes he was sometimes a friend, sometimes a foe. He respected them, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Flathead, for they understood the same truth he did. Only the strong survived, and the mountains took no pity. But not all his days were filled with blood. There were moments of peace, too. John would sit by his fire, watching the sun fade behind the peaks. He'd smoke his pipe, listening to the sounds of wolves calling across the valley. He spoke little, but in those moments, his silence said more than words ever could. He was becoming something different, a man who belonged nowhere, yet everywhere. He was not from the East anymore. He was not part of any tribe. He was something in between, a lone wolf, a wanderer of the untamed world. The winters were the hardest. Snow piled high. Food ran low. Many trappers died from cold or hunger, but not John. He adapted. He built better shelters, crafted snowshoes, stored meat in frozen rivers. He could go months without seeing another human face, and when he did meet others, trappers, traders, sometimes bandits, he kept his distance. In the wild, trust was a dangerous luxury. Some said he once fought off a grizzly with only his knife. Others claimed he could walk barefoot through snow without leaving tracks. No one knew how much of it was true. But by now, John Johnston had become something of a legend himself, even before his darkest days began. Sometimes the mountains weren't the only threat. Bands of outlaws roamed the frontier, stealing pelts and killing for whiskey. When they crossed paths with Johnston, they didn't walk away happy. He wasn't a man of mercy. He believed in balance. If you take from me, I take from you. Over time, that reputation followed him like a shadow. He didn't look for fights, but the West had a way of finding them. He was too strong, too proud, too wild to bend. Yet even in that world of hardship, John found something human. Among the Flathead people, he found kindness. They traded with him, shared food, and taught him their ways. He respected their courage, their harmony with the land, and in time, from that world came love. He met a young woman from the Flathead tribe, graceful, quiet, with eyes that carried the calm of the forest. Her name was never recorded in history, but she became the heart of his story. For the first time, John wasn't just surviving. He was living. They built a cabin together, near a cold mountain stream. He hunted, she cooked. He chopped wood. She sang softly by the fire. They didn't speak the same language, but love doesn't need words. That winter was kind to them. The snow fell light. The wolves stayed away. For a while, John thought he had found his peace. He would tell stories to her, about the sea, about storms, about the cities back east. She would laugh, though she didn't understand everything he said. And when the night came, They would fall asleep to the sound of wind and fire, two souls alone in the vast, cold world. But together. But peace in the mountains never lasts long. And in that silence, destiny was waiting, cruel and patient, for soon the crow would come. And when they did, everything John had built would burn. Everything he loved would vanish in a storm of fire and snow, and the man who once dreamed of freedom would soon become the most feared name in the West, liver-eating Johnston. The cabin was silent. Snow covered the ashes where a home once stood. John Johnston stood in the middle of it, staring at what was left of his life. He didn't speak, he didn't move. The wind blew around him, carrying smoke and memory. His wife was gone. The woman who had made the wilderness feel warm was gone forever. For a long time, he didn't believe it. He searched the woods, calling her name, but only the crows answered. When he found the small tracks in the snow, men's tracks, many of them, he knew the truth. The crow tribe had passed through. Whether they wanted revenge or food or simply blood, no one would ever know. But to John Johnston, it didn't matter why. The why died with her. Something inside him broke that day. The quiet, patient man of the mountains was gone. In his place stood something new, something fierce, cold, and merciless. That was the birth of the crow killer. From that moment forward, his life had one purpose: revenge. He began to hunt. Not animals this time, but men. He knew the land better than anyone. He could travel for days without leaving a trail. He could smell smoke miles away, and he could strike like a wolf. He tracked small war parties, followed their camps, waited until they slept, and then he attacked. No one could escape him. Some stories say he killed hundreds, others say dozens. The truth has been lost in the telling, but every campfire in the West carried his name. They said he moved like a shadow through snow. They said he never missed with his rifle, and they said that after every kill he would cut out the liver of the man he'd slain and eat it. That was the story that spread fear. Was it true? Maybe not. Maybe it was only something whispered by his enemies. But in the West, truth mattered less than reputation. The idea of a man who ate the livers of his enemies was enough to make even the bravest warrior tremble. So the legend grew. He became Liver-Eating Johnston. In the years that followed, John lived like a ghost. He built no new home. He slept in caves, under trees, beside frozen rivers. He carried a long rifle, a heavy knife, and the rage that would not fade. He didn't talk about his wife again, not even to friends. When other trappers asked why he fought the crow, he would only say, "They took something from me." To some, he was a hero, avenging the wrongs done to him. To others, he was a monster, one man declaring war on an entire people. But to John Johnston, he was neither. He was simply unfinished. He lived by a rule he made for himself: never strike the innocent, never take without need, but never forgive a crow. When he met a crow warrior, the fight was already decided. He never backed down. Sometimes the crow came for him in groups, hoping to end his vengeance. They trapped him once near the Bighorn River, outnumbered and cornered. They thought it was the end, but John was too clever. He waited until night, crawled through the snow to the river, and disappeared beneath the ice. He drifted with the current until he was miles away. By sunrise, he was free, and the crow who hunted him were not. That story alone turned him from man to myth. The crow killer's fame spread beyond the mountains. Traders told the tale along the Missouri. Soldiers heard it in frontier forts. Even settlers in distant towns repeated the name with a mix of fear and awe. Still, for all his ferocity, John was not without honor. He never attacked women or children. He traded fairly with tribes that left him alone. He respected courage, even in his enemies. When a crow warrior faced him bravely, John would bury the body himself, speaking softly in words only the mountains heard. Over time, something began to change in him. The rage that had once burned hot began to cool. Killing gave him no peace. The faces of the dead never brought his wife back. He started to wonder what he had become. The man who once sought only freedom was now chained to hatred. Years passed. The wars between settlers and tribes grew. The old ways of the mountain men were fading. Trapping was no longer enough to live on. The world was moving forward, but John was still walking backward into the past. He had become part of an older time, a time of blood and silence. Some say that one day he met an old crow chief in the wilderness. The chief looked at him and said, "You have taken many lives. You have had your vengeance. Will you now take peace?" For a moment, John didn't know what to answer. Then he nodded. From that day, the Crow and John Johnston lived in uneasy peace. The war was over. He still carried his knife. He still hunted. But the killing stopped, and for the first time in many years, the mountains felt quiet again. The legend of the liver-eating Johnson continued to grow, even as the man himself began to disappear into history. People told stories that weren't true, but they kept the spirit of him alive. They said he could walk 50 miles without stopping. They said bullets bounced off his skin. They said the devil himself feared to meet him on a dark night. But in truth, John Johnston was only a man who lost everything and refused to die. He had loved once, and that love had been taken. What followed was not glory, but grief wearing the mask of vengeance. When travelers spoke his name, they spoke it with both fear and respect. For in a land where death was common and mercy rare, one man had fought back against the world and survived. That was the story of the Crow Killer, the man the frontier could not break. And though time would fade his face and twist his tale into legend, somewhere in the high snows of the Rockies his spirit still walks, watching, waiting, guarding the memory of the woman he once loved. The years that followed were dark ones. The mountains, once a place of peace, had turned into John Johnston's hunting ground. He lived alone, surrounded by snow, wolves, and memories that refused to fade. Every sunrise began with silence, and every sunset ended with the weight of the past. For 2 long decades, the story of liver-eating Johnson spread across the frontier like wildfire. Some said he was a ghost. Others swore they had seen him walking through the trees with blood on his coat and fire in his eyes. No one truly knew how many men he killed, but all agreed on one thing. He never stopped moving. He was not fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting against his own emptiness. John became a shadow in the wilderness. He built no home and trusted no one. He traveled light, a rifle, a knife, a tomahawk, and his will to survive. In winter, he slept in caves or under fallen trees. In summer, he moved high into the mountains, where the rivers were clean and the sky endless. Sometimes he met other trappers or traders, and they would share a fire. They spoke carefully around him, never asking about the past. One wrong word could mean trouble, but if a man showed respect, John would share his food and stories of the land. He spoke with a slow, deep voice, rough like gravel. He could name every mountain, every river, and every trail where someone had died. The wilderness had become his church, and revenge his prayer. The Crow still feared him. They learned to travel in large groups when near his hunting grounds. Some tribes even made peace offerings, leaving gifts near his camps: meat, beads, tobacco. They believed if they honored his spirit, he would not come for them. Yet not all the stories were about killing. In some, John helped settlers who were lost in the mountains. He guided them through blizzards, shared food with starving travelers, and fought off wild animals that threatened them. He could be ruthless, but also strangely kind. It was as if the man who once loved deeply still lived somewhere inside the monster he had become. That contradiction was what made him legend. A killer to some, a savior to others. One year, while traveling near the Yellowstone River, he came across a small group of soldiers under attack by warriors. Outnumbered, wounded, and freezing, they had little chance to live. John joined the fight without a word. His rifle cracked again and again, each shot precise and deadly. When the battle ended, the ground was red, and the soldiers were still alive. They offered him payment. He refused. All he said was, "I didn't do it for you. I did it because they started it." Then he walked away, disappearing into the trees. To those soldiers, it was like meeting a myth in the flesh, a man who lived by no law but his own. As the years passed, the West began to change. More settlers came. The fur trade slowed. The old world of the mountain men was dying. But John didn't belong anywhere else. He kept to the high country, far from towns, far from the noise of progress. Sometimes he would come down to trade pelts for whiskey and bullets. He'd sit alone in the corner of a saloon, silent, watching everyone. Men whispered his name but never dared approach. It was said that when he looked at you, it felt like he could see straight through your soul. Even in the crowd, he was alone. The legend of liver-eating Johnson grew larger than the man himself. Stories twisted and changed. They said he fought off entire war parties by himself. They said he once walked 300 miles just to kill one man who had insulted him. They said he was part bear, that bullets couldn't kill him, that even death was afraid to take him. The truth was simpler and sadder. He was only a man who had lost everything and survived too long to know what peace felt like. The crow eventually stopped hunting him. Even they understood that vengeance has an end. They began to respect him, not as an enemy, but as a spirit of the mountains, a man who had proved himself through endless hardship. When a crow warrior crossed paths with him in peace, they would nod, offer tobacco, and move on. The war between them was over, though no one had declared it. As time wore on, the fire inside John began to dim. The killing no longer filled the emptiness. He had avenged his wife 100 times over, but her face still haunted him at night. He would stare into his campfire, seeing her smile flicker in the flames, hearing her voice in the wind. Sometimes he spoke to her softly, as if she were still there. The mountains had given him everything, and taken everything back. One morning, after years of wandering, John looked around and realized he was no longer hunted. The crow had made peace. The trappers were gone. The frontier was shrinking and the world was changing. But he was still the same, a man out of time. He began working as a guide for travelers, leading them safely through dangerous passes. He hunted not for survival, but for trade. People started to know him not just as a killer, but as a protector. He told younger men stories of the old days, of snow so deep you could vanish in it, of grizzlies that could crush a man with one swipe, of rivers that froze so fast they trapped fish alive in the ice. His voice softened, but his eyes never did. The rage was gone, replaced by something quieter, a heavy sadness that never left him. And so the legend of liver-eating Johnston slowly became something else. He was no longer just a symbol of vengeance. He was a reminder of what the West had been, a place of blood and bravery, of loss and survival. The man who once lived for revenge had outlived it. The world that made him was disappearing, and soon so would he. But even as time erased his tracks, the stories remained. They traveled from campfire to campfire, across towns and into books and movies. The myth of the crow killer had become part of the soul of the American frontier. And somewhere, far away in the mountains, the wind still whispered his name, liver-eating Johnston, the man who lived too long and feared nothing but peace. The snows came early that year. The mountains were silent, the rivers frozen, and the smoke from Johnston's small fire rose straight into a still gray sky. He sat alone, as always, his rifle resting across his knees. Age had crept into his body quietly. The muscles were still strong, but the years had left their mark. The scars on his hands told stories no one else could read. He had been many things: a sailor, a hunter, a husband, a killer, and a legend. But now, as the world grew older around him, he began to wonder what all the fighting had been for. The crow were no longer enemies. The old war between them had burned itself out. There were new dangers now: soldiers, settlers, and railroads that carved through the land like blades. The old ways of the mountain men were dying, and John, who had once lived for revenge, now lived for something he didn't yet understand. One morning, while traveling near the Yellowstone, he saw smoke rising from a small crow camp. He stopped at the edge of the trees, his hand on his rifle, out of habit more than fear. A young warrior noticed him. Instead of reaching for a weapon, the man raised his hand in greeting. John hesitated. It had been years since he'd spoken to anyone from that tribe. He could have turned and walked away, but something inside told him not to. He stepped forward. Slowly, cautiously, he entered the camp. The people there did not attack. They did not run. An old crow chief wrapped in a buffalo robe stood up and looked into John's eyes. There was no hatred there, only weariness. "You are the one they call Crow Killer," the chief said quietly. John nodded once. "You have taken many lives," the old man continued. "I have lost many sons, but I am tired of ghosts." "Are you?" John did not answer at first. He thought of his wife, of the fire, of the ashes he had never forgotten. He thought of the faces of the men he had killed, some brave, some foolish, all gone. Finally he said, "Yes." The chief walked forward and placed a small pipe in John's hands. They sat together by the fire and smoked in silence. That was the day the war truly ended. From then on, the crow and Johnston lived in a kind of quiet peace. He no longer hunted them, and they no longer hunted him. In some strange way, they had become part of the same story. Two enemies who had fought until they understood each other. The Crow began to see him as more than a killer. They called him Dapyakabsaroka, the man who hated the Crow, but who now walked with them in peace. He traded with them, helped them hunt, and sometimes shared food around their fires. He spoke little, but his actions said enough. The years rolled by like slow rivers. John's beard turned gray. His shoulders bent a little under the weight of time. But his eyes, sharp, watchful, fierce, never lost their fire. He became something of a guardian of the high country. Travelers knew his name. Some feared him. Others sought him out. If you were lost in a snowstorm, you hoped that liver-eating Johnston would find you. If you were foolish enough to steal from him, you prayed that he wouldn't. Even the animals seemed to respect his presence. Wolves would keep their distance. Bears, when they crossed his path, would back away slowly. The wilderness knew him as one of its own. He often visited the gravesite of his wife, a simple place marked by stones, hidden deep in the woods where her cabin once stood. There he would kneel and speak softly, though no one ever knew what he said. Perhaps he told her that the fighting was over. Perhaps he told her that he was sorry. Or maybe he just sat there in silence, because after a lifetime of noise, silence was the only thing that still made sense. For John, peace did not come suddenly. It came in small moments: a warm fire, a sunrise over the ridges, the laughter of children from a crow camp. Those moments were his reward for surviving everything that had come before. The younger men sometimes came to him for advice. They wanted to know how he had lived so long, how he had fought so many and never fallen. He would shrug and say, "Don't fight unless you must. And when you must, don't lose." They laughed at the simplicity of it. But those words carried the truth of a lifetime. He told them stories of the old days, of trapping in the deep snow, of grizzlies taller than a man, of nights so cold that the stars cracked in the sky. He never bragged about his battles. If someone mentioned the name liver-eating Johnston, he would frown and say, that was another man. In a way, he was right. The Crow killer had died long ago, somewhere in the smoke and blood of the past. The man who remained was older, wiser, and finally at peace with himself. But peace did not mean weakness. Even in his old age, John could still draw his knife faster than most men could blink. Once, when a drunk in a saloon tried to challenge him, John looked at him, calm and steady, and said, "Son, I've buried better men than you." The drunk walked away. He didn't need to fight anymore. His presence was enough. As the 1870s turned to the 1880s, the frontier world continued to fade. Towns grew where wild grass once stood. The mountain men were gone, replaced by ranchers, miners, and soldiers. But John Johnston, old and unbending, remained. He was the last of his kind, a living reminder of the Wild West before fences, before laws, before mercy. And though the world around him changed, one truth remained unshaken. He had faced the worst of man and nature and lived to see peace. He had been broken, rebuilt, and reborn by the land itself. In his final years, the Crow killer no longer carried hatred. Only memory, only silence, only the wind in the mountains, his oldest, truest friends. And in that silence, at last, John Johnston found what he had searched for his entire life: peace. The Old West was changing. The wild rivers were being bridged. The quiet valleys now echoed with the sound of hammers, wagons, and gunfire. The age of the mountain men was ending, and civilization was crawling across the land like a slow tide. For most men who had lived by the wilderness, this was the end. But John Johnston was not most men. He had survived every kind of danger the world could offer: blizzards, hunger, war, and heartbreak. And now, in his later years, he found himself facing something new: peaceful society. It was strange, loud, and filled with rules he didn't understand. But deep down, he knew he could not outrun time forever. He came down from the high country for good sometime in the 1870s. His beard was long and gray now. His face was carved by wind and sun. His hands were hard as stone, his back straight as a rifle. He arrived in the rough town of Red Lodge, Montana, a small settlement filled with miners, gamblers, drifters, and dreamers. It was the kind of place that needed strong men, not to kill, but to keep order. And no one was stronger or more respected than John liver-eating Johnston. When the town council asked him to serve as marshal, he agreed. He didn't need the money. He didn't need the fame. But he needed a purpose. After a lifetime of fighting against the world, maybe now he could fight for something. Being a lawman was different from being a hunter. In the wilderness, the rules were simple: kill or be killed. In town, the law had words, papers, judges, and patience. Patience was not something John had much of, but the people respected him. When he walked down the muddy streets, everyone stepped aside. His reputation alone kept most trouble quiet. No one wanted to find out if the stories about him were true. A drunk with a pistol once bragged that he could outdraw the old mountain man. John looked at him calmly and said, "Son, I've buried more men than you've met." The drunk sobered up fast. There were no challenges after that. Still, the town was full of problems. Fights broke out every night. Bandits came through, miners cheated each other, and strangers disappeared in the dark. John handled it all with the same steady hand he had used in the mountains. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply acted, quick, quiet, and final. Once 2 men tried to rob a stagecoach outside town. John tracked them for 3 days through the snow, alone, without backup. He brought them back in ropes, half frozen and terrified. When asked how he did it, he said, "They left tracks. I followed them." To him, it was that simple. Over time, people stopped calling him liver-eating Johnson. They started calling him Marshal Johnston. For the first time in his life, he wore a badge, a small piece of metal that meant something new. It didn't erase his past, but it gave it meaning. The man who had once hunted enemies now protected strangers. He was a hard man, but he was fair. He treated every person equally, whether they were rich or poor, white or native, friend or foe. To him, respect was earned by actions, not by words. He became known for settling arguments before they turned bloody. When a fight started in a saloon, he'd step in and say, "You can settle this now, or I'll settle it for you." They always chose to stop. The years passed quietly. John found a small kind of peace in the routine of his work. He had a place to sleep, a fire to sit by, and people who greeted him each morning. The loneliness of the mountains still followed him, but in this new life it was softer, like an old scar that no longer hurt. Sometimes at night he would sit outside the jailhouse, staring at the stars. He thought of the wilderness, of the roaring rivers and silent peaks. He missed it, but he also knew he couldn't go back. The mountains belonged to his past. This town, this badge, this strange new world, that was his present. He had become something he never expected, a symbol of law, not chaos. By the 1880s, his legend had spread again, not as a killer, but as a man who had tamed himself. People traveled miles just to see him, to shake his hand, to say they'd met the infamous crow killer who now kept the peace. He didn't care for attention, but he understood that stories had power. And maybe, just maybe, if people remembered him as a lawman instead of a murderer, his wife's spirit could finally rest. But time, as always, moved on. The Wild West was shrinking. The frontier was closing. Railroads crossed the land, bringing settlers and soldiers. The gunfights faded, replaced by laws and borders. John grew older. His steps slowed. His hands began to tremble. The same man who had once lived alone in blizzards now needed help climbing stairs. But even in weakness, he carried himself with quiet dignity. People still greeted him as Marshal, and that title seemed to mean more to him than any other he had ever earned. It was the one that proved he had changed, that the wilderness had not broken him, but shaped him. In time, he left Red Lodge and moved farther south, working as a deputy in Colorado. He served as a peacekeeper until his body refused to keep pace with his will. When he finally laid down his badge, he did it without regret. He had spent his last good years serving the living instead of chasing the dead. The man who had once been feared by all had finally become a protector. Johnston had found something that few men ever did: a second life, a chance to rewrite his story before the final chapter. He had seen the world at its worst, and he had helped make it a little better. And though he never spoke it aloud, those who knew him said they could see it in his eyes, a quiet kind of peace, the kind that only comes after a lifetime of war. The years had finally caught up to him. John Johnston, once the strongest man in the Rockies, now walked with slow, careful steps. His beard was white, his hands stiff, and his breath short. But his eyes, those hard, gray eyes, still held the same light they always had. He had lived longer than most men ever dreamed to. He had survived war, blizzards, hunger, and heartbreak. Now, in his old age, he faced a new kind of challenge: peace. For a man who had lived his life in motion, stillness was not easy. He missed the sound of the wind through the trees, the crack of ice on the river, the smell of pine smoke. The towns were too loud, too crowded. The laws he once enforced had replaced the wilderness he loved, and yet he had done what no one expected. He had lived long enough to see the world change, and to change with it. When his health began to fail, he left his post as a deputy in Colorado. His joints ached, his vision dimmed, and the winters felt colder than before. He tried to stay near the frontier, but even the frontier was dying. So he went south, searching for warmth and rest. By the late 1890s, he found himself in Los Angeles, a growing city filled with noise and movement, a strange place for a man who had once called the Silent Mountains home. He entered the soldiers' home there, a quiet refuge for aging veterans. They gave him a small room, a bed, and 3 meals a day. It was simple, and he was grateful. He never spoke much to the other men. They were soldiers from wars fought long after his own battles had ended. They couldn't imagine what it meant to live alone in the wilderness for decades, to lose everything and keep walking. But they respected him. Everyone did. When the nurses asked his name, he told them plainly, Johnston. People used to call me the Crow Killer. Some laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others went quiet, because even in old age the name carried weight. He didn't like the city. He spent most of his time sitting outside, staring at the sky. The air was thick and dusty, not crisp and cold like it used to be. But when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the sound of rushing water, still feel the sting of snow on his face. Every now and then, a visitor would come. A reporter, a traveler, someone who had heard the stories. They wanted to see the man who had once terrified the frontier. John would smile slightly and say, "Stories grow taller than the man who lived them." He never bragged about his past. He never denied it either. He just accepted it, as a man accepts the scars on his hands. His body weakened, but his spirit didn't. When the younger veterans offered him help, he refused. "I can walk," he would say, even when it took him minutes to stand. He had faced wolves and war parties alone. He wasn't about to ask for pity now. At night he dreamed of the mountains, endless, white, and quiet. Sometimes he dreamed of his wife, waiting by a fire. Sometimes he dreamed of the crow standing in peace beside him. He would wake with tears in his eyes and whisper to the empty room, "Soon." In 1900, John Johnston grew ill. His heart was tired. The nurses said he barely ate, barely spoke. But on clear mornings, they would still find him outside, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunrise. It reminded him of home. On January 21, 1900, the man the world had called liver-eating Johnson took his final breath. He was about 75 years old. He died quietly, without pain, without fanfare. Just a simple end for a man whose life had been anything but simple. They buried him in Los Angeles, far from the mountains that had shaped him. For a time it seemed his story would end there, forgotten in a city of strangers. But legends never stay buried for long. 74 years later, in 1974, a group of students from Cody, Wyoming, learned about the old mountain man who had died so far from the place he called home. They felt it wasn't right. This was a man who belonged to the Rockies, not the pavement. They started a campaign to bring him back. They raised money, wrote letters, and gathered signatures. Their cause drew attention across the country, and from a man who had once played him on screen, Robert Redford, star of Jeremiah Johnson. Together, the children and the actor brought the mountain man home. John Johnston's remains were moved from Los Angeles to Cody, Wyoming, near the land he had once roamed. During the ceremony, Redford helped carry the coffin. Hundreds gathered. Old trappers, ranchers, and schoolchildren watched in silence as the man of legend returned to the soil that had made him. When the last shovel of dirt was placed, the crowd stood still. The wind moved softly through the grass, almost like a whisper. It was as if the mountains themselves were welcoming him back. Now, in the quiet hills of Wyoming, a simple stone marks his grave. It reads, "John Johnston, liver-eating Johnson, mountain man." There are no long speeches carved into it, no list of deeds or years of war. Just a name, and a legend behind it. Travelers still visit. They leave coins, tobacco, small stones, and sometimes a note that says thank you. They come not to worship him, but to remember what he stood for: strength, endurance, and the wild spirit of a world that no longer exists. Johnston's story is one of pain and survival, of rage and redemption. He began as a man seeking freedom, became a man consumed by revenge, and ended as a man at peace. His life is proof that even the hardest hearts can change, and that even in the roughest times, there is a path toward peace. If you keep walking long enough. He lived wild. He fought hard. He died quiet, and though his body rests in the earth, the legend of liver-eating Johnston still walks the mountains he once called home, free, fierce, and forever unbroken. When Johnston died in 1900, it might have seemed like the end of his story. But in truth, it was only the beginning of something bigger, the birth of a legend. The man was gone, but the stories remained. And with each retelling, the line between truth and myth began to fade. The first stories were simple. Trappers, old soldiers, and travelers told them around campfires. They spoke of a man who lived alone in the mountains, who fought bears with a knife, who could vanish in snow without leaving a track. They told of his revenge against the crow and how he ate the livers of those he killed. Some said he did it to take their courage. Others said it was a warning to anyone who crossed him. Each storyteller added a new detail, a bigger bear, a colder storm, a braver fight. And soon Johnston was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, a creature of the wild, a legend carved from the bones of the frontier itself. The truth was much smaller, but also far more human. John had lived through hunger, grief, and loss. He had made mistakes. He had fought for survival. He had carried his pain for a lifetime and somehow found peace in the end. But people didn't want a story about peace. They wanted a story about power. And so the myth of liver-eating Johnston grew, fierce, bloody, and unforgettable. In the early 1900s, writers began to collect the old tales. Frontier newspapers published wild accounts of Johnston's life. Some claimed he killed over 300 Crow warriors. Others said he once escaped captivity by cutting off his own leg to free himself from chains, a tale likely borrowed from another mountain man. The facts didn't matter much. The image of the savage avenger did. By the 1930s and 1940s, Western writers had turned him into an almost supernatural figure, a ghost of vengeance who lived by his own code. The American West loved heroes like that, men who stood alone, men who answered to no law but their own sense of justice. In a world that was becoming modern and civilized, stories of men like Johnston kept the wild spirit alive. Then came the book that defined the legend forever, Crow Killer, The Saga of Liver-Eating Johnston, by Raymond W. Thorpe and Robert Bunker, published in 1958. The authors mixed history, rumor, and imagination into a story that felt more like myth than biography. It told of Johnston's lonely war against the Crow, of his travels, his fights, his strength, and his fury. The book captured the brutality of the wilderness and the raw power of one man's will. It was not always accurate, but it was unforgettable. Readers devoured it. They wanted to believe in the man who could not be broken, the mountain warrior who took vengeance into his own hands. And through that book, Liver-Eating Johnston became immortal. 14 years later, the legend found a new voice, this time on the big screen. In 1972, Hollywood released the film Jeremiah Johnson, starring Robert Redford and directed by Sidney Pollack. The movie was inspired by both Crow Killer and the novel Mountain Man by Vardis Fisher. But this version of the story wasn't about rage. It was about solitude. It was about a man who turned his back on society and tried to live alone in nature. The film softened the myth but deepened the emotion. Redford's Jeremiah Johnson was quiet, humble, and haunted. He fought when he had to, but he wasn't a monster. He was a man trying to find peace in a world that refused to give it to him. Audiences loved it. The film became a classic, not just for its beauty, but for its soul. It made people dream of the mountains, of a life away from noise and greed, of the freedom that only wilderness could offer. And though the movie never used his real name, everyone knew who the story was about. The spirit of John Liver-Eating Johnston lived on in Jeremiah Johnson. The movie brought his story back into light, and with it came curiosity. Historians, writers, and fans began searching for the truth. They dug through old military records, journals, and trapper tales. What they found was a man far more complex than legend allowed. He had served as a scout, a lawman, and a protector. He wasn't a bloodthirsty savage, but a man driven by grief. The liver-eating tale, historians believed, was likely a myth, a story told by others to exaggerate his fury. In the end, the truth and the legend became one, two sides of the same coin. The myth made him famous. The truth made him real. When his body was reburied in Cody, Wyoming in 1974, it wasn't just a funeral, it was the closing of a circle. A man who had wandered too far from home was finally brought back to rest under the same mountains that had shaped him. It was poetic justice that Robert Redford, the man who played his spirit on screen, was there to carry his coffin. That day, as hundreds watched the burial, the line between the man and the myth blurred forever. Was he the Crow Killer? The Mountain Man? The Peacekeeper? Or simply John Johnston, a man who had lived too much life for one name to hold? Perhaps he was all of them. Today, visitors still come to his grave. Some come because of the stories, some because of the movie, and some because they feel something deeper, a pull toward the raw courage of a man who refused to be tamed. Children still hear his name in campfire tales. Writers still borrow his spirit for their heroes. And every time a man or woman looks to the mountains and dreams of freedom, they are, in some small way, remembering liver-eating Johnson, because legends never truly die. They live on in every story told, in every quiet moment of strength, in every soul that refuses to break. He began as John Johnston, sailor, trapper, husband, avenger. He became the Crow Killer, the terror of the mountains. And he ended as a symbol of endurance, redemption, and peace. That is how a man becomes a myth, not by how he lived, but by what he leaves behind. Long before the stories turned him into a monster or a hero, John Johnston was just a man with a heart, a past, and pain that ran deeper than any wound. The world would remember him for the name. Liver-eating Johnson, the Crow Killer, the Mountain Man. But those names were only masks. Beneath them was something far simpler, a man who lost everything and somehow kept going. When people spoke of him, they spoke of violence. They told of his battles, his strength, his revenge. They said he could crush a man with his bare hands, track enemies through a snowstorm, and survive weeks without food. But they rarely spoke of his silence. John Johnston was not a loud man. He didn't brag. He didn't tell stories about himself. The few who truly knew him said he carried a sadness that never left his eyes. He laughed rarely, smiled little, but when he did, it was warm. The kind of smile that came from a place of deep understanding. He had lived a life few could imagine, and it had carved away everything unnecessary. He was simple, direct, honest. He said what needed to be said and nothing more. The death of his wife had changed him forever. It had turned a quiet man into a storm. But that storm eventually passed, leaving behind not rage but wisdom. He came to understand something most men never do, that pain never truly ends, but it can teach. He often said, "The mountains take from you what you don't need. Then they give back what you never had." To him, the wilderness was both enemy and teacher. It tested his body, broke his heart, and rebuilt his soul. In a way, that's what made him who he was. Not the killing, not the revenge, but the endurance. He didn't just survive nature. He became part of it. Many people who met him later in life said they expected a savage. What they found instead was an old man with calm eyes and a quiet voice. He was polite, even gentle. He treated everyone with the same respect, whether they were settlers, soldiers, or native tribesmen. He never forgot that all men were just trying to survive, each in their own way. There was a humility about him. He never sought fame. He didn't write letters or keep journals. He never tried to defend himself or correct the wild stories told about him. When asked about them, he would only say, "People tell what they want to believe. I don't own their stories." He knew the truth, that legends grow because people need them. And if his legend helped others believe in courage, or strength, or the power to endure, then maybe that was enough. Yet beneath that calm exterior, he remained a man marked by loneliness. He had outlived everyone he loved. He had no children, no family, no one to remember him when he was gone. His only family was the land itself, the mountains, the rivers, the sky. They were the only things that had never betrayed him. Sometimes he would speak of them as if they were living things. "The mountain listens," he once told a young trapper. "The river remembers. The wind carries everything you've done, good or bad. Out here, Nothing stays buried. Those words stayed with the boy for years. And that was Johnston's gift. Even in silence, he taught others how to live. Behind the myth of a killer was the mind of a philosopher. He understood the cost of violence better than anyone. He knew that killing never healed anything. It only left more ghosts behind. And though he could never undo what he had done, he learned to live with it. He forgave himself, and in doing so, found peace. As he grew older, he often reflected on the world he had known. He saw how the frontier had changed. The land that was once endless and free now had fences and towns. He didn't hate progress, but he pitied those who would never know what it felt like to live without boundaries. Men today, he said once, build walls to keep out the cold. But in doing so, they shut out the stars. For him, the wilderness had been both punishment and freedom. It had taken his love, but given him purpose. And in that contradiction, he found meaning. The real Johnston wasn't perfect. He drank hard. He could be rough, stubborn, and quick to anger. He lived by his own law, not by any written one. But even in his flaws, there was honesty. He never pretended to be anything other than what he was, a man shaped by hard times and harder choices. He was living proof that even the most broken soul can find redemption, not through miracles, but through endurance. He didn't speak of faith, but he lived it, faith in the land, in his hands. In the idea that no matter how deep the pain, you keep walking forward. When people remember liver-eating Johnston, they often think of violence. But the truth is that his greatest strength was not how many men he killed. It was that he survived his own darkness. He turned vengeance into wisdom, loneliness into peace, death into legend. The world saw a killer, but the mountains saw something else, a man who learned how to live with the ghosts that hunted him. In the end, he was not the crow killer, or the lawman, or the hermit. He was simply Johnston, a man who had lived a full, brutal, beautiful life. He loved once and lost. He hated once and healed, and he left behind a story that would outlive him by centuries. The legend was loud, but the man behind it was quiet. And maybe that's why his story still matters. Because deep down, beneath every myth of greatness, there is always something small, something human, something true. And that truth, the story of one man's fight to find peace in a wild, unforgiving world, is the real legacy of liver-eating Johnston. Time passes, but legends never really die. They just change shape. They fade from memory, then return, stronger than before, carried by those who still whisper their names. Liver-eating Johnston, the crow killer, the mountain man, the lawman, the myth, left this world more than a century ago. Yet even now his shadow stretches across the rugged land he once called home. In the high country of Wyoming, where the wind still howls across empty plains, his grave rests under an open sky. There are no walls there, no fences, no noise, only grass, mountains, and silence. It's the kind of peace he searched for his entire life. Travelers stop by to leave offerings, a coin, a feather, a matchstick pipe, a stone. Some leave notes. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for surviving. They don't all know the full story. They just feel something, a quiet pull toward the kind of freedom that men like Johnston once lived for. And maybe that's what his story truly means. Freedom. The right to walk your own path, no matter how rough, no matter how alone. The legend of liver-eating Johnston has become more than one man's tale. It has become a reflection of the American spirit, bold, stubborn, unbreakable. In every generation, his story rises again, told in new voices and new ways. Writers still study him. Historians still debate him. Filmmakers still chase the mystery of who he really was. Was he a hero, a monster, or simply a man who refused to surrender to the world's cruelty? The truth is, he was all of them. The 1972 film Jeremiah Johnson brought his legend to millions. Robert Redford's quiet, soulful performance gave the story new life. In that film, the wilderness was not just a backdrop, it was a mirror of the human soul. It showed loneliness, resilience, and the search for meaning in a world that doesn't always give answers. The movie turned him into a symbol for those who longed for solitude and authenticity. In an age of noise, he represented silence. In an age of comfort, he represented endurance. In an age of chaos, he represented peace. To this day, the line, "You can't cheat the mountain," echoes through outdoor culture. It's more than dialogue, It's philosophy. It's what Johnston lived and died by. Beyond the screen, his story continues to inspire. Survivalists quote his name. Historians lecture about his life. Artists paint him, standing tall against a storm, rifle in hand, beard thick with frost. To them, he's not just a man of violence, but a man of strength, will, and transformation. In him, people see something timeless. The idea that no matter what happens, you can stand back up. That no matter how far you fall, you can still find redemption. But his legacy isn't only about toughness. It's about forgiveness, the hardest kind of strength. The kind that takes years to learn. The kind that doesn't come from the barrel of a gun, but from the heart of a man who finally makes peace with his ghosts. Johnston didn't die angry. He died quiet, and that quiet is what gives his story power, because it shows that even the fiercest souls can find rest, and that peace is not weakness, it is victory. Modern readers who look back at his life see more than just a Wild West adventure. They see a story about being human, about loss, rage, forgiveness, and the search for meaning in a changing world. He lived in a time when men faced the elements with their hands, but the battles he fought, grief, guilt, isolation, are the same ones people still face today. That's why his legend survives. It isn't about killing or conquering. It's about enduring. It's about finding your way through pain and still choosing to live. In classrooms, his story is taught as part of American folklore. In documentaries, his name is spoken with respect. And in quiet mountain towns, old-timers still tell stories of the Crow Killer, the man who defied death. Loved deeply and found peace at last. Even now, people visit the place where he's buried, not out of curiosity, but out of connection. Standing there under the wide Wyoming sky, you can almost feel him. Not as a ghost, but as a presence. Steady, silent, eternal. The mountain wind feels like his breath. The rustling grass sounds like his whisper. And if you listen close enough, you can almost hear him say, "Keep walking. No matter what happens, keep walking." That's the message he left behind. Not a warning, not a threat. A lesson that life will take everything from you, and still it's worth living. That pain can turn you bitter, or it can make you strong. That peace isn't something you find. It's something you earn. John Liver-Eating Johnston earned it the hard way. He walked through fire and came out the other side. And in doing so, he became something more than flesh and bone. He became a story, a symbol, a reminder of what it means to survive. Today, more than 100 years later, his name still echoes wherever there are wild places left. In the roar of a river, in the howl of a storm, in the silence after the snow falls, he is part of the land now, the same land that shaped him. He belongs to the West, untamed, unforgiving, and unforgettable. His story lives on in every soul who refuses to give up, in every person who stands tall after loss, in every wanderer who finds peace in the quiet. Johnston's body rests in the earth, but his spirit lives in the wind. It reminds us that no matter how far we fall, how deep the cold, how heavy the sorrow, we can rise again. That is the true legacy of the Crow Killer. That is the story of Liver-Eating Johnston.